I constantly remember, still to this day, every time I hear Fast Car play, I can remember sitting in the front seat of my mom's car because I was the oldest one and that's how it worked. That's who got the front seat. And having the windows down, driving through Streetsville, listening to that song over and over again. It's crazy how even when you haven't heard a song in so long, it can bring you back to that place and time.
So I remember when we were driving in your car, speed so fast I felt like I was drunk. City lights lay out before us and your arm felt nice wrapped around my shoulder. And I had a feeling that I belonged. I had a feeling I could be someone, be someone, be someone.
Welcome to This Broken Mixtape, the podcast that rewinds and presses play on the soundtrack to your life. I'm Jeff Wu.
And I'm Justin Lee.
Simone Ferkul is a Toronto-based multidisciplinary designer who specializes in interior and industrial design. In her own words, Simone combines traditional means of production with modern-day processes to create a progressive design approach that is responsive to contemporary culture. We spoke with Simone about winning Best in Show at Umbra's 2017 Compact Living exhibition for her Sling Planter project, being a superfan of The National, and secretly seeking validation from music snob clerks at local record shops.
This week on the show, we have interior and industrial designer Simone Ferkul. Welcome to the show, Simone.
Thank you so much. Excited to be here.
So walk us through sort of your journey with design and why you chose to sort of devote your life to creating things.
So I guess you can say I'm sort of a product of my environment. I grew up with an illustrator as a mom and a contractor as a dad. So sort of falling into interior design seems like the natural thing to do. My mom likes to tell a story where I was like 8 years old and watching Debbie Travis, out of all people, who's more of a decorator. And that's just, I was like, I'm going to be an interior designer. And then since then, it never really changed. I would say now it's evolved more. So during the day, I work for a studio called Dialogue, mainly designing hospitality projects, hotels and restaurants. And then on the side, because the creative process is so individual, and it's harder to do when you're in a larger team, having complete control over the creative process, I've sort of started the industrial design side of things. And that sort of kept my mind busy and occupied to have something that's completely my own. And I am a maker at heart. And so that's why I try to do at least 3 or 4 major projects a year that is about me either getting more hands-on or just designing something that I can call my own. So, yeah.
Okay. Design is such a broad field, but
For sure.
You know, the difference between, what would you say is the difference between designing a space versus a product, a tangible object?
It's interesting that you say that because I think there's such a discrepancy of scale between the two things. And I think that's one part I like the most about it, where a space, you're looking at all of these pieces coming together to tell a story or a narrative, especially within hotel design. Whereas like this object is this unique piece that always has its own story and creative dialogue that sort of has come to its fruition. You're curating all these pieces together. So it's sort of like the big scale and the small scale coming together and sort of balancing each other out. So I think that's where I've really found the passion within creating the smaller objects, but also really loving creating these stories that bring all of these smaller objects together. Yeah.
In terms of actual projects, spaces, whether it's in Toronto or elsewhere, give us some examples of ones that you've worked on.
So I've done Andes Hotel, which is a boutique hotel in Ottawa. I just finished a project out in Banff, which was pretty exciting. Just finished a couple of weeks ago and opened this week on Canada Day out of all days. And then I've worked overseas in France and in China But right now at Dialogue, a lot of our projects are more Canadian based, which is pretty exciting as a designer to sort of impact the own vernacular of Canadian design.
Okay.
Yeah.
In terms of inspiration, where do you look to for inspiration for your projects?
It ranges so much. I would say everything from, like, unfortunately, Pinterest, which I think people tend to sway away from, to traveling. I love traveling. It's one of my biggest passions I have. Always sort of with the camera at hand. Now with iPhones, it's way easier to snap things that sort of can come part of your story while you're designing. I would also say music is a big impact on me. I spend a lot of my time when I'm trying to figure out my ideas, especially with the industrial design side of things, where I am the controller of what I make. And then how do you decide what that one object is? It's sort of a large task. So I often find myself putting on one album and listening to start from finish and brainstorming and mind mapping to sort of come up with an object that I'm really passionate about.
Can you give us an example of like a specific album that might have been something that you listened to over and over again for a specific project?
I remember being this was the first design week I did, so it was about 2012. And I think at the time, one of the national albums had just come out, and I remember listening to it probably too much to the point I was still living at home that my mom, even though she loves them too, said maybe slow down on listening to that. But it almost becomes a rhythm to your work process as well, that you get so used to, and you sort of trust in the lyrics and the songs themselves to sort of carry you through with that process.
Right. So let's get a little bit more into music. What was being played around the house when you were growing up?
Oh, my mom was probably the biggest influence on me, and it was everything from Tragically Hip to REM to The Cure, The Smiths, all those great bands. She also had a pretty big female singer powerhouses that she liked to play. So people like Annie Lennox and Sinead O'Connor, Tracy Chapman. Like, I constantly remember, still to this day, every time I hear Fast Car play, I can remember sitting in the front seat of my mom's car, because I was the oldest one, and that's how it worked. That's who got the front seat. And having the windows down, driving through Streetsville, listening to that song over and over again. It's crazy how, even when you haven't heard a song in so long, it can bring you back to that place in time.
So it's one thing to like sort of inherit or your parents' listening habits or listening their music taste, but what was that first album that you kind of decided on your own that this is what you want to listen to and buy? Lady in Song 2. Okay.
I'm not sure. It was like a compilation album. It probably had really weird people like Faith Hill and Natalie Merchant, Natalie Imbruglia, all those great early 2000s, late 90s singers and songwriters. That was probably the first one. And then I probably went to Aqua to Spice Girls from that. But always having this strange like comeback to what my mom sort of had around us. So there's this always strong like rock undertone to a lot of the stuff I listen to. So
you were saying earlier that your mom really likes that national album. Do you share a lot of music with her?
I do, for sure. And I even remember her either sending me text messages, oh, I was listening to The Q and the National just released a new song, and I'm like, thanks Mom, I know. But it's crazy looking at all the concerts I've gone to. I've brought my mom, so I've seen the National about 14 times.
Wow.
Which is probably...
I've seen them 6 times, and I thought that was a lot. Wow.
Like in different cities?
I've seen them in New York, but mostly in Toronto. Like, I've been following them for a bit, a long time, and seeing their evolution. But my favorite time I saw them was in Massey Hall. I can remember this distinctly, sitting, it was 8th or 9th row. My mom was beside me, And it was her first time sort of going to a concert in a while. And Matt Berninger, because he gets crazy during the shows, and him walking through all the seats, singing Mr. November, and sort of stopping right in front of my mom and I. And I remember saying, Mom, he'll probably stop in front of us because somehow every time I see him, he stops right in front of me. I don't plan this or pay him behind the doors, but it just happens. And he did. And I remember the biggest grin of my mom standing beside me and seeing that. So,
yeah, I was at that show. I remember that show.
Yeah, it's great.
So, I mean, you know, I feel like I hear this a lot about sort of naysayers of the National. And I think this is kind of like a really lazy way of sort of describing music, but I hear often that like, oh, the National, they're so boring, they're so dull. What would you say to that? I mean,
I don't know. I'm sure as somebody who's seen them for 6 times, it's also something that you're like, no, they aren't. They have, I feel like all the naysayers are people who haven't seen them live. If you listen to their albums from start to finish, sure, they can get a little bit melodic at times. But there's something that Matt and the Dresner brothers bring to stage when they're all together and you're watching them. And to me, it's watching the two twins, and you can see when they like hit a note perfectly and they smile at each other, and seeing that beauty on stage is just something so incredible. And I don't know, they do have such a variety when they're playing live. Like, they know how to put together a great set list.
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
Despite seeing them that many times, I've never seen them play the same songs in the same order. So, I don't know. I feel like that could be said for a lot of people in terms of, oh, they like all sound the same. Or my favorite one is, oh, they're such sellouts.
Right.
And I feel there's like an interesting thing that happens with a lot of music lovers where it crosses the line of a little bit of snobbery as soon as they're played on larger radio stations or on a TV show. But these people need to make a living too.
Yeah. I don't think there's anything like
discredit their music at all. And I've also seen a lot of their side projects as well. So I've seen them as LV. I saw that show. That was at...
Is it Opera House?
The Opera House. And that show was great. And then there was also that weird... I don't even know how to pronounce it because they removed all the vowels. The two brothers did, which is more of like an instrumental album. It's like Lisgriff or something along those lines. And they just have such an impact on the music scene that I don't even think people realize what's happening behind the scenes. Or there's this great album called Dark Was the Night that is probably, I'm going to say, one of the greatest compilation albums put together. The variety of artists on that piece is quite incredible, and I love listening to it.
I actually went to the live show that they did at Radio City Music Hall. I think that was 2009. Maybe?
Jealous.
And it was ridiculous. Like everyone from Sharon Jones to Sufjan Stevens to obviously the National. Who else was there? I can't even remember at this point.
Yeah.
It was incredible.
I'm jealous. So jealous.
So, I mean, with that, what is your favorite National album?
Alligator.
Alligator, okay.
Yeah.
Was that your entry point, or was that the first album you listened from?
No, my first album was the one before that. That was, I'm going to forget the name. It's the one that has, I want to say it's called Dirty Lovers or something like that. It's the album right before that. It was more of an EP they released.
The one with the Wasp Nest, right?
Yeah. It was a full album that they released. So that was it. But Alligator, to me, is one of my favorite albums. I think it was the album that made me become the most in love with them.
Sure.
Has some of my favorite songs, like Secret Meaning and City Middle. Some great ones. But, I mean, every album they release, there's always one song I fall in love with. So.
Right. So in terms of listening to music while you're working, I mean, other than the National, what other bands and artists have really sort of inspired you in your work?
Well, right now I'm listening to a lot of, I would say, female vocalists. Lou Dillon is one of my favorite ones, Julie Brine, RDS Harding. I also just discovered a band a couple of months ago called Rolling Blackouts Coastal Fever, which is a band from out in Australia. And I saw them play a couple of weeks ago at the Garrison. And you know when you see a band that hasn't quite made it yet, but you know they're gonna like blow up the scene soon? And it was just one of those moments that as soon as they started playing, I think it hit everybody in that room that this is some good shit.
Yeah, that's a really special feeling that you can never sort of re-experience, right?
And I remember seeing it with that. One of them was Rye, too. I remember seeing them at the Great Hall. There's about 25 people in the room. The whole Great Hall was lit with real candles. Still not sure how they got away with that. And they started the show in complete darkness. And not many people know the lead singer is actually a male. They all expect
I thought it was a female at first as well, yeah.
To be a female. And then he starts singing. And just, when you sink at a concert, I think everybody around me was having this feeling. My friends have started to trust me when I say just come to this show.
Right.
It will amaze you.
What was your first concert, just out of curiosity?
My first concert was Sugar Jones.
Oh. This is like a lot of people might not remember that name, but Sugar Jones was sort of a short-lived female group. Was it a
TV show.
Right.
It was Canada's attempt of making the band, I guess. And I saw them in Hamilton. And then I remember my uncle actually brought me to that show. The same uncle also brought me to NSYNC. Those are like my first like early concerts. So
just looking at your Instagram, I know that you it seems like you have a pretty big vinyl collection.
Yes.
What do you like about vinyl in terms of listening to vinyl versus digital music? Like what sort of benefits and why do you choose to listen to vinyl over? I mean, I'm sure you listen to digital music as well, but
to me, it's sort of like a threefold thing. It's like the physical aspect of it and having this piece that's often beautifully wrapped, has a whole graphic display, which as a designer I obviously love, and the idea of you being forced to listen to that thing from start to finish. Especially with the record player I have, I can't sort of like if I lift it up and then drop it, it'll probably scratch the album. So, so it's that piece and also the sound. You just can't. It's like the second best thing to see in a band live, and I get so lost in that. One of my favorite things is I have 2 roommates right now, and Saturday mornings they're both usually not around, sort of making my morning tea, going to pick out what album I'm going to listen to, and just sitting on the couch and doing fuck all for that whole entire album.
That's awesome.
And it's just so great to be lost within the music for that duration of the time, and I allow myself just to have that. Yeah,
I think that you touched on something that is really important about music, is that it's, music in 2018 has become this passive experience where people are always going to be multitasking, doing other things while they're listening to something on Spotify. And that's fine. I get it. Like, people have many things to do throughout the course of the day.
Yep.
But the fact that you're able to just listen to that record in its entirety and not do anything else is pretty special.
And I think, too, like, you have to make a conscious decision to buy that album. Like, there is, like, a little bit of a financial... Whereas Spotify, I pay my $9 a month and I could get whatever music I want. So if I want to temporarily download an album for like a couple of days, listen to it, decide don't really love it and get it off my phone, then it's fine. But I also think there are some great things about more so digital music as well, where it's opening up the world to a whole new genre and groups that you probably wouldn't have never come across. And sometimes the recommendations are bang on.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's scary.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it terrifies me too sometimes. I'm like, are you in my head?
So would you say that when you buy a vinyl album, you've listened to it already digitally and then you get it, or it's just like you anticipate a release and you grab it, or you just like the way an album looks and you're just curious?
Well, I think it depends. Sometimes as I've listened to one song by the artist and fell so in love with that song that I'm like, okay, this whole album is probably killer. I've done things where I've bought vinyls like in the under $5, $10 range of, oh, I like the cover.
Yeah.
I like the risk that you take there. And sometimes it's crap and sometimes it works out. But I would say overall, especially with artists that I know, I'll just go buy the vinyl first. And I want that to be my first listening experience of the whole album. I remember I bought the Lou Dillon album on total risk because I heard she was good and falling in love with it so much, and then seeing her live, and it was an amazing experience. Andy Schaff was opening for her, and it was in the basement of the Drake Underground, which is a magical place in terms of scale to see a show.
Risk is actually an interesting word when it comes to music, because that's something that I feel like Jeff and I are a little bit older than you. And really, there was a lot of risk involved when we were buying music as teenagers and even in our early 20s. You know, a lot of times you would only hear that one single, if that. And you would just, based on that, you're like, okay, I'm going to decide to buy this album. And now, because, music is basically free or $10 a month, there is no risk involved. And I think because of that, there's something missing. I think there needs to be a little bit of a reward system, when it comes to art and music.
I think so too. And I think that's where, I also think it's an issue too with design and art too, where we live in such a disposable culture, which is unfortunate. But I don't know, there's something I get off taking those risks that personally I would never give up. But I think it's hard to explain to somebody who just doesn't understand the power of taking those risks and sort of coming across something that you would never have come across. I remember I went to an arts high school, so a lot of my friends were musicians. My one main friend, Ryan, was sort of my gig buddy growing up. And we would come downtown to Queen Street, and there was a record store called Criminal Records. I'm not sure if you guys remember it.
Yeah.
That's a great shop.
It was a great shop. And I remember being 14, 15, 16, all through high school, and going in there. And I remember we made that our record shop because the guys paid attention to us as young kids. Going into other record shops, we would sort of be judged for the music that we picked out or whatever it is. And I remember, I think I was buying Fleet Foxes at the time. And I remember the guy who was working the cash, who I can't remember his name right now, but which is unfortunate because we had plenty of conversations. Him saying, oh, you like them? You should listen to, I think it was Okanagan River. And he was like, you'll love them. And I remember standing in that record store for 2 to 3 hours, and he would just be putting on vinyl, asking our opinion on things, and sort of valuing music in the same way that we saw it as sort of our escape from Mississauga. We loved going down to that shop because of that reason. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was really sad when that store closed.
So
Yeah. And also in terms of, music was one thing, but their band shirts and their posters were awesome.
Yeah, it was a really good shop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then they had little concerts in the back. I remember seeing Do May Say Think in the back of that shop. Got hot. But it was this great little music community that sort of lacked and was proud of the fact that they lacked this sort of judgmental side that sometimes comes with music. And I loved going there. There was a great transparency to what you sort of listen to.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's bring it back to your work. I know last year your incredible Sling Planters series won Best in Show at Umbra's. compact living exhibition. Walk us through your creative process of how you came up with that product.
So the brief for the project is to create something for small spaces. Toronto, everything is small apartments we all live in. But it was a daunting task at first because I was like, there's 700 million things you can design for a small apartment. Remember creating lists, going through everything from like, oh, I'm going to create a shelf that has multi-uses or something that you can store something. And then I wrote down plants pretty early on in the process and just sort of left it to the side. And I remember going back to it because I'm a pretty big plant mom in my apartment. Mm-hmm. And I said, I can't find any planters that aren't macrame. Uh-huh. They're all macrame. Yeah. And I just want something cool and simple that sort of pays homage to the macrame, but doesn't look like my Nana sort of macrameed it up for me. So that was sort of the heart of where that idea came from. And from there, it just sort of became an endless sort of evolution of design, simplifying it, paring it back, adding little details like the little bolo at the end, which is funny because now it's named the Bolo Planter because Umbra already had a product called Sling. Okay. So that's where that evolved. And then from there, flashback, I guess that was 2017, being January, almost February, design week. It's freezing cold in Toronto. And the show happened, and the repertoire of industrial designers in that show was incredible. And I sort of felt like I was like, I'm the fraud. I'm the girl who like only went to school for interior design, and now I'm here and doing this thing. And I remember I thought like, I have no chance of winning this. Like, this isn't gonna happen. And then they called my name, and there's this embarrassing video of me online, and I'm sort of shaking. I turn all red. My friends are screaming in the background. And then I won. And then it was this crazy aftermath of, okay, this is a thing. Mm-hmm. And part of winning it is they were going to make it part of their collection. Mm-hmm. So from that point, I started a whole new journey of learning about mass manufacturing. Mm-hmm. Which was a world I never thought I was going to necessarily get that experience with, because I had created my prototype by hand. My roommate, Talia Silva, is a ceramic artist, so she taught me how to make the form at the base. I got all the metal pieces casted, and then I filed them down and finished them myself. I have a great metalsmith that I worked for that did sort of the top pieces of the planters. So it was a very personal process, and then going from this personal handmade process to, oh, that 6 extra inches of string is going to cost us extra money, like we have to cut it. Mm-hmm. So it became this interesting process for me as a designer and understanding what sacrifices I wanted to make to the design. Mm-hmm. And at first it was a struggle because I had thought out every single detail of that planter. Now it doesn't have the bolo, but the actual ceramic piece of the pot slides up and down. Mm-hmm. And then flashback to this year, so exactly a year later, in February it released on market. And then getting emails from my friends saying, I went to go try to buy your planter on the Umbra website, and it says it's sold out. And I'm like, what? Like, what are you talking about? And then contacting my friends who worked at Umbra saying, oh, like, yeah, we are sold out. Like, we have none left until we get like our next shipment in like 2 weeks or whatever it was. And I'm like, this is nuts. Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is crazy. I don't know. I guess I just didn't dream big and imagine that happening. And it's sort of given me the confidence to sort of take a little bit more risk with my design process as well.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So for Design Week, I mean, tell us about, so that was your first Design Week in terms of...
No, I started right after. So I started with a show called Capacity. So that was in 2012, and it's an all-female design show that happens. So I started that and did a collection of jewelry for that. That ended up getting on some blogs, which as sort of a young designer, I found really exciting and refreshing. And then from there, I've sort of like tried to challenge myself a little bit more every single year. I did come up to my room once. Mm-hmm. It took about 10 years off my life because taking over a whole room, and it was just me and another artist, Susan Dobson, that I teamed up with. And I was brought in because she was a photographer. And then she just wanted to project images into space. And she's done these beautiful sort of filming of the moon. And I remember being contacted by my professor from university, Yana. She's like, would you be interested in teaming up with this artist? She has such great imagery and ideas, but we just feel in the space putting a projection, and especially because Come Up to My Room is about embracing each one of those rooms in the Gladstone. Would you be interested in possibly like partnering up with her? And I said, sure. And then I remember having our first meeting, and she's sort of like a mother figure, very established photographer in sort of like the scene of art in Toronto, and being like she's sort of big deal, and I'm like the little Toronto designer, and us sitting down and collaborating, and right away it was so natural. It was like we were meant to be together, and we both landed on the moon as sort of this object that people slowly look at. Like if the moon's big at night and you're walking down the street, it's the thing you look at, and this beauty of slow looking and taking things in. So we ended up creating a multitude of projections, but it was all centered off this one piece in the middle of the space where if you project onto etched mirror, it creates a second projection. So here was the moon, but the moon was in the space 6 times. You only see the moon once. Mm-hmm. And it was also about engaging people from the street. So like we had it projecting and actually looking like the moon rises, like the sun, in the middle of a window, and seeing people stop on the street and also engaging with it. So it was this pretty amazing little project that we did. And everybody ended up coming into our room because they said it was so peaceful. Mm-hmm. And her son actually did a custom soundtrack for it. And I remember, and I think this really speaks to the power of sound and music altogether. I remember a blind man walking into the room, and he's touching me on my shoulder and saying, like, are you the designer and artist of this space? And I was like, yes, I am. And he thanked me for putting sound into the space, because that's what becomes heightened from his perspective. Mm-hmm. Like he's going to a gallery show, walking into every space, and not necessarily being able to take in what that is. And I think too that's something that I try to take into sort of my interior design practice as well. Like there's a whole other side of spaces that impact people who have different disabilities. Uh-huh. And it's pretty amazing to hear what they take away from an experience. Mm-hmm, so, yeah.
That kind of reminds me of this like question I often think about. Of the 5 senses, if you were in a situation where one of them disappeared, like indefinitely, which one would you choose? Because I know you're a very visual person, but being a music lover, also your hearing is very important.
And I also love food. Mm-hmm. But to be honest, like if I was never able to like see or hear anything ever again, I think I would completely lose it. Mm-hmm. So to me, I'm like sort of take my hand or my sense of taste.
Smell.
Yeah. I guess with smell, yeah.
Yeah. But you take away smell, and like food isn't going to be as good anymore.
Yeah. That's true.
Yeah. So I don't know, it's tough.
Yeah.
They're all so precious.
I know.
So that's almost time for us. But, you know, I want to ask you as an interior designer in terms of the record stores and music venues that we have in Toronto, which are some of your favorites?
Massey Hall, which is now closed.
Closed for 2 years, yeah.
My favorite record store, I would have to say, is Rotate This.
Mm-hmm.
I remember getting a smile from the main shop owner, the female. And I think I was working for years to get that smile when I brought up the vinyl. And she smiles at me now when I bring up vinyls. I'm like, yes.
Is it the woman with short hair?
Yeah.
You've crossed over. Yeah.
No, you know what? She's actually really nice, and I've talked to her sometimes, but she's not like...
No.
She doesn't give a lot, right?
No,
she's very...
she doesn't give a lot, but when you get that smile from a record store employee, when you bring up that vinyl, like I feel like I've done something so right that day.
I think it's softened a little bit.
Yeah.
I think it used to be like, I remember being super scared.
Yeah.
In their old space.
In their old space. It just, it's just
like
not
they've calmed down over the years, but they
Yeah.
used to be very much sort of compared to the staff at, you know, that movie High Fidelity.
Yep.
Because, you know, just pure judgment. Like,
Oh,
especially
for
when you
sure.
would buy like concert tickets, like, oh yeah, you want to go to that show? Like,
cool.
it's,
Yeah. They don't even say that. It's just their eyes.
Yeah, you can tell what they're thinking.
It's like they're looking into your soul and burning it.
Yeah.
But also the Great Hall, I love for a concert venue. I liked it before the renovation. I liked the rawness before. Now it's not as great, but it's also across the street from my house, so it makes going to shows really easy.
Convenient, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much for being on our show. Where can people check out your work?
Probably SimoneFerkul.com. I also have Instagram, and it's just Simone Ferkul. It's easy to find.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Season 2, Episode 11 of This Broken Mixtape featuring multidisciplinary designer Simone Ferkul. For more goodies, visit thisbrokenmixtape.com to check out this episode's Spotify playlist. There you will also find all of our past interviews and custom illustrations for each show. Please take the time to subscribe, rate, and share our podcast however you're tuning into us today. Also, if you have any comments, feedback, or ideas for guests, feel free to drop us a line through our website, Instagram, or Twitter. Next week's guest will be executive producer of Revolver Films, Richard Curidan. Thanks for listening. We really appreciate it. Cheers.